Okay, I'm waiting for somebody to let me in the office because I forgot my keys, so I'm going to be reading Chapter 6 in the car. And this is my microphone, so don't wonder what it is. It's not on your screen. It's not your screen being cracked. All right, Chapter 6, How to Crowd Worry Out of Your Mind. I shall never forget one night when Marion J. Douglas was a student of mine in one of my classes. I have not used his real name. He requested me, for personal reasons, not to reveal his identity. But here is his real story as he told it to the class. He told us how tragedy had struck at his home not once but twice. The first time he had lost his 5-year-old daughter, a child he had adored. He and his wife thought they couldn't endure that first loss, but, as he said later, 10 months later, God gave us another little girl, and she died in 5 days. This double bereavement was almost too much to bear. I couldn't take it, this father told us. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't rest or relax. My nerves were utterly shaken and my confidence gone. At last, he went to the doctors, and one recommended sleeping pills and another recommended a trip. He tried both, but neither remedy helped. He said my body felt as though it was encased in a vice, and the jaws of the vice were being drawn tighter and tighter. The tension of grief. If you have ever been paralyzed by sorrow, you know what he meant. But thank God I had one child left, a 4-year-old son. He gave me the solution to my problem. One afternoon, as I sat around feeling sorry for myself, he said, "Daddy, will you build a boat for me?" I was in no mood to build a boat. In fact, I was in no mood to do anything. But my son is a persistent little fellow. I had to give in. Building that toy boat took about 3 hours. By the time it was finished, I realized that those 3 hours spent building that boat were the first hours of mental relaxation and peace I had in months. That discovery jarred me out of my lethargy and caused me to do a bit of thinking. The first real thinking I had done in months. I realized that it is difficult to worry while you're busy doing something that requires planning and thinking. In my case, building a boat had knocked me out of the ring, or had knocked worry out of the ring. So I resolved to keep busy. The following night I went from room to room in the house, compiling a list of jobs that ought to be done. Scores of items needed to be repaired. Bookcases, stair steps, storm windows, window shades, knobs, locks, leaky faucets. Astonishing as it seems, in the course of 2 weeks I had made a list of 242 items that needed attention. During the last 2 years I have completed most of them. Besides, I have filled my life with stimulating activities. 2 nights per week I attend adult education classes in New York. I have gone in for civic activities in my hometown and am now chairman of the school board. I attend scores of meetings. I help collect money for the Red Cross and other activities. I am so busy now that I have no time for worry. No time for worry! That is exactly what Winston Churchill said when he was working 18 hours a day at the height of the war. When he was asked if he worried about his tremendous responsibilities, he said, "I'm too busy. I have no time for worry." Charles Kettering was in the same fix when he started out to invent a self-starter for automobiles. Mr. Kettering was, until his retirement, vice president of General Motors, in charge of the world-famous General Motors Research Corporation. But in those days he was so poor that he had to use the hayloft of a barn as a laboratory. To buy groceries, he had to use $1,500 that his wife had made by giving piano lessons. That's a lot of money on groceries, even in those days. Later, he had to borrow $500 in his life insurance. I asked his wife if she wasn't worried at the time like that. "Yes," she replied. "I was so worried I couldn't sleep, but Mr. Kettering wasn't. He was too absorbed in his work to worry." The great scientist Pasteur spoke of, quote, "the peace that is found in libraries and laboratories." Why is peace found there? Because the men in libraries and laboratories are usually too absorbed in their tasks to worry about themselves. Research men rarely have nervous breakdowns. They haven't time for such luxuries. Why does such a simple thing as keeping busy help to drive out anxiety? Because of a law, one of the most fundamental laws ever revealed by psychology, and that is this, that it is utterly impossible for any human mind, no matter how brilliant, to think of more than one thing at any given time. You don't quite believe it? Very well, then let's try an experiment. Suppose you lean back right now, close your eyes, and try, at the same instant, to think of the Statue of Liberty and of what you plan to do tomorrow morning. Go ahead and try it. You found out, didn't you, that you could only focus on either thought in turn, but never both simultaneously? Well, the same thing is true in the field of emotions. We cannot be pepped up and enthusiastic about doing something exciting and feel dragged down by worry at the same time. One kind of emotion drives out the other. And it was that simple discovery that enabled Army psychiatrists to perform such miracles during the Second World War. When men came out of battle so shaken by the experience that they were called psychoneurotic, Army doctors prescribed keep 'em busy as a cure. Every waking minute of these nerve-shocked men was filled with activity, usually outdoor activities such as fishing, hunting, playing ball, golf, taking pictures, making gardens, and dancing. They were given no time for brooding over their terrible experiences. Occupational therapy is the term now used by psychiatry when work is prescribed as though it was a medicine. It is not new. The old Greek physicians were advocating it 500 years before Christ was born. The Quakers were using it in Philadelphia in Ben Franklin's time. A man who visited a Quaker sanitarium in 1774 was shocked to see that the patients who were mentally ill were busy spinning flax. He thought these poor unfortunates were being exploited until the Quakers explained that they found that their patients actually improved when they did a little work. It was soothing to the nerves. Any psychiatrist would tell you that work, keeping busy, is one of the best anesthetics ever known for sick nerves. Henry W. Longfellow found that out for himself when he lost his young wife. His wife had been melting some sealing wax at a candle one day when her clothes caught fire. Longfellow heard her cries and tried to reach her in time, but she died from the burns. For a while, Longfellow was so tormented by the memory of that dreadful experience that he nearly went insane. But unfortunately for him, his 3 small children needed his attention. In spite of his own grief, Longfellow undertook to be father and mother to his children. He took them out for walks, told them stories, played games with them, and immortalized their companionship in his poem, The Children's Hour. He also translated Dante, and all these duties combined kept him so busy that he forgot himself entirely and regained his peace of mind. As Tennyson declared when he lost his most intimate friend, Arthur Hallam, quote, "I must lose myself in action, lest I wither in despair." Most of us have a little trouble losing ourselves in action while we have our noses to the grindstone and are doing our day's work. But the hours after work, they are the dangerous ones. Just when we're free to enjoy our own leisure and ought to be the happiest, that's when the blue devils of worry attack us. That's when we begin to wonder whether we're getting anywhere in life, whether we're in a rut, whether the boss meant anything by that remark he made today, or whether we're losing our sex appeal. When we're not busy, our minds tend to become a near vacuum. Every student of physics knows that nature abhors a vacuum. The nearest thing to a vacuum that you and I will probably ever see is the inside of an incandescent electric light bulb. Break that bulb, and nature's forces fill in the theoretically empty space. Nature also rushes in to fill the vacant mind. With what? Usually emotions. Why? Because emotions of worry, fear, hate, jealousy, and envy are driven by primeval vigor and the dynamic energy of the jungle. Such emotions are so violent that they tend to drive out our minds of all peaceful, happy thoughts and emotions. James L. Mersell, professor of education at Teachers College, Columbia, put it well when he said, quote, "Worry is the most apt to ride you ragged, not when you are in action, but when the day's work is done. Your imagination can run riot then, and bring up all sorts of ridiculous possibilities and magnify each little blunder. At such a time," he continued, "your mind is like a motor operating without its load. It races and threatens to burn out its bearings or even to tear itself into bits. The remedy for worry is to get completely occupied doing something constructive." But you don't have to be a college professor to realize this truth and put it into practice. During the Second World War, I met a housewife from Chicago who told me how she discovered for herself that the remedy for worry is to get completely occupied doing something constructive. I met this woman and her husband in the dining car while I was traveling from New York to my farm in Missouri. This couple told me that their son had joined the armed forces the day after Pearl Harbor. The woman told me that she had almost wrecked her health worrying over that only son. Where was he? Was he safe? Or in action? Would he be wounded? Killed? When I asked her how she overcame her worry, she replied, "I got busy." She told me that at first she had dismissed her maid and tried to keep busy by doing all of the housework herself, but that didn't help. The trouble was, she said, that I could do my housework almost mechanically without using my mind, so I kept on worrying while making the beds and washing the dishes. I realized I needed some new kind of work that would keep me busy both mentally and physically every hour of the day. So I took a job as a saleswoman in a large department store. That did it, she said. I immediately found myself in a whirlwind of activity, customers swarming around me, asking for prices, sizes, and colors. Never a second to think of anything except my immediate duty. And when night came, I could think of nothing except getting off my aching feet. As soon as I ate dinner, I fell into bed and instantly became unconscious. I had neither the time nor the energy to worry. She discovered for herself that John Cowper Ponies, that's a weird name, meant what he meant when he said in The Art of Forgetting the Unpleasant, quote, "A certain comfortable security, a certain profound inner peace, a kind of happy numbness, soothes the nerves of the human animal when absorbed in its allotted task." And what a blessing that is so. Osa Johnson, one of the world's most famous women explorers, told me how she found release from worry and grief. You may have read the story of her life. It is called I Married Adventure. If any woman ever married adventure, she certainly did. Martin Johnson married her when she was 16 and lifted her feet off the sidewalks of Chanute, Kansas, and set them down on the wild jungle trails of Borneo. For a quarter of a century, this Kansas couple traveled all over the world, making motion pictures of vanishing wildlife of Asia and Africa. Some years later, they were on a lecture tour showing their famous films. They took a plane out of Denver, bound for the coast. The plane plunged into a mountain. Martin Johnson was killed instantly. The doctor said Osa would never leave her bed again. But they didn't know Osa Johnson. 3 months later, she was in a wheelchair lecturing before large audiences. In fact, she addressed over 100 audiences that season, all from a wheelchair. When I asked why she did it, she replied, "I did it so that I would have no time for sorrow and worry." Osa Johnson had discovered the same truth that Tennyson had sung about a century earlier. I must lose myself in action, lest I wither in despair. Admiral Byrd discovered the same truth when he lived all alone for 5 months in a shack that was literally buried in the great glacial ice cap that covers the South Pole. An ice cap that holds nature's oldest secrets. An ice cap covering an unknown continent larger than the United States and Europe combined. Admiral Byrd spent 5 months there alone. No other living creature of any kind existed within 100 miles. The cold was so intense that he could hear his breath freeze and crystallize as the wind blew it past his ears. In his book, Alone, Admiral Byrd tells all about those 5 months he spent bewilderingly and soul-shattering darkness. The days were as black as the nights. He had to keep busy to preserve his sanity. At night, he says, before blowing out the lantern, I formed the habit of blocking out the morrow's work. It was a case of assigning myself an hour, say, to escape tunnel, half an hour to leveling drift, an hour to straightening up the fuel drums, an hour of cutting bookshelves in the walls of the food tunnel, and 2 hours of renewing a broken bridge in the man-hauling sledge. It was wonderful, he says, to be able to dole out time this way. It brought me an extraordinary sense of command over myself. And he adds, without that, or an equivalent, the days would have been without purpose, and without purpose they would have ended, as such days always end, in disintegration. Note that last again. Without purpose, the days would have ended, as such days always end, in disintegration. If you and I are worried, let's remember that we can always use good old-fashioned work as medicine. And that was said by no less an authority than Dr. Richard Cabot, formerly professor of clinical medicine at Harvard, in his book, What Men Live By. Dr. Cabot says, quote, as a physician, I have had the happiness of seeing work cure many persons who have suffered from trembling palsy of the soul, which results from overmastering doubts, hesitations, vacillation, and fear. Courage given us by our work is like the self-reliance which Emerson has made forever glorious. If you and I don't get busy, if we sit around and brood, we will hatch out of a whole flock of what Charles Darwin used to call the wibble-gibbers. And the wibble-gibbers are nothing but old-fashioned gremlins that will run us hollow and destroy our power of action and our power of will. I knew a businessman of New York who fought the wibble-gibbers by getting so busy that he had no time to fret and stew. His name is Temper Longman. Tremper. All these weird names, I swear to God. He was a student of one of my classes, and his talk on conquering worry was so interesting, so impressive, that I asked him to have a late supper with me after class, and we sat in a restaurant until long past midnight discussing his experiences. Here is the story he told me. 18 years ago, I was so worried I had insomnia. I was tense, irritated, and jittery. I felt I was headed for a nervous breakdown. I had reason to be worried. I was treasurer of the Crown Fruit and Extract Company. We had $500,000 invested in strawberries packed in gallon tins. For 20 years, we had been selling these gallon tins of strawberries to manufacturers of ice cream. Suddenly, our sales stopped because the big ice cream makers such as National Dairy and Borden's were rapidly increasing their production and were saving money and time by buying strawberries packed in barrels. Not only were we left with $500,000 in berries we couldn't sell, but we were also under contract to buy $1 million more of strawberries in the next 12 months. We had already borrowed $350,000 from the banks. We couldn't possibly pay off or renew these loans. No wonder I was worried. I rushed out to Watsonville, California, where factories were located, and tried to persuade our president that conditions had changed and that we were facing ruin. He refused to believe it. He blamed our New York office for all the trouble and poor salesmanship. After days of pleading, I finally persuaded him to stop packing more strawberries and to sell our new supply on the fresh berry market in San Francisco. That almost solved our problems. I should have been able to stop worrying then, but I couldn't. Worry is a habit, and I had that habit. When I returned to New York, I began worrying about everything. The cherries we were buying in Italy, the pineapples we were buying in Hawaii, and so on. I was tense and jittery, couldn't sleep, and, as I have said already, I was heading for a nervous breakdown. In despair, I adopted a way of life that cured my insomnia and stopped my worries. I got busy. I got so busy with problems demanding all my faculties that I had no time to worry. I had been working 7 hours a day. I now began working 15 and 16 hours a day. I got down to the office every morning at 8 o'clock and stayed there every night until almost midnight. I took on new duties and new responsibilities. When I got home at midnight, I was so exhausted when I fell in bed that I became unconscious in a few seconds. I kept up this program for about 3 months. I had broken the habit of worry by that time, so I returned to a normal working day of 7 or 8 hours. This event occurred 18 years ago. I have never been troubled with insomnia or worry since then. George Bernard Shaw was right. He summed it all up when he said, quote, "The secret of being miserable is to have the leisure to bother about whether you're happy or not. So don't bother to think about it. Spit on your hands and get busy. Your blood will start circulating, your mind will start ticking, and pretty soon all this whole positive upsurge of life in your body will drive worry from your mind. Get busy, keep busy. It's the cheapest kind of medicine there is on this earth, and one of the best. To break the worry habit, here is rule number 1. Keep busy. The worried person must lose himself in action, lest he wither in despair." Alright, time for another car reading, this time chapter 7. There we go. Look how Beatles is spelled. It's not about the band. It's about don't let the Beatles, the critters, get you down. Here is a dramatic story that I'll probably remember as long as I live. It was told to me by Robert Moore of Maplewood, Maplewood, I don't know what that was so hard, New Jersey. "I learned the biggest lesson of my life in March 1945, he said. I learned it under 276 feet of water off the coast of the Indochina. It was one of 88 men aboard the submarine Baya SS-318. We had discovered by radar that a small Japanese convoy was coming our way. As daybreak approached, we submerged to attack. I saw through the periscope a Japanese destroyer escort, a tanker, and a mine layer. We fired 3 torpedoes at the destroyer escort, but missed. Something went haywire in the mechanics of each torpedo. The destroyer, not knowing that she has been under attack, continued on. We were getting ready to attack the last ship, the mine layer, when suddenly she turned and came directly at us. A Japanese plane had spotted us under 60 feet of water and had radioed our position to the Japanese mine layer. We went down to 150 feet to avoid detection and rigged for a depth charge. We put extra bolts on the hatches in order to make our sub absolutely silent. We turned off the fans, the cooling system, and all electrical gear. 3 minutes later, all hell broke loose. 6 depth charges exploded all around us and pushed us down to the ocean floor, a depth of 276 feet. We were terrified. To be attacked in less than 1,000 feet of water is dangerous. Less than 500 is always almost fatal. And we're being attacked in a trifle more than half of 500 feet of water. Just about knee-deep as far as safety was concerned. For 15 hours, that Japanese mine layer kept dropping depth charges. If a depth charge explodes within 17 feet of a sub, the concussion will blow a hole in it. Scores of these depth charges exploded within 50 feet of us. We were ordered to secure, to lie quietly in our bunks and remain calm. I was so terrified I could hardly breathe. This is death, I kept saying to myself over and over. This is death. This is death. With the fans and cooling system turned off, the air inside the sub was almost over 100 degrees. But I was so chilled with fear that I put on a sweater and a fur-lined jacket. I still remember trembling with cold. My teeth chattered. I broke out in a cold, clammy sweat. The attack continued for 15 hours, and then ceased suddenly. Apparently, the mine layer had exhausted its supply of depth charges and steamed away. Those 15 hours of attack seemed like 15 million years. All my life passed before me in review. I remember all the bad things I had done, all the little absurd things I had worried about, and I had been a bank clerk before I joined the Navy. I had worried about the long hours and the poor pay and the poor prospects of advancement. I had worried because I couldn't own my own home. I couldn't buy a new car. I couldn't buy my wife nice clothes. How I hated my old boss, who was always nagging and scolding. I remember how I would come home at night sore and grouchy and quarrel with my wife over trifles. I'd worried about a scar on my forehead, a nasty cut from an auto accident. How big all those worries seemed years ago. But how absurd they seemed when depth charges were threatening to blow me to kingdom come. I promised myself then and there that if I ever saw the sun and the stars again, I would never worry again. Never, never, never. I learned more about the art of living in those 15 terrible hours in the submarine than I had learned by studying books for 4 years in Syracuse University. We often face the major disasters of life bravely and then let the trifles, the pains in the neck, get us down. For example, Samuel Pepys tells in his diary about seeing Sir Harry Vane's head chopped off in London. As Sir Harry mounted the platform, he was not pleading for his life, but pleading with executioner not to hit the painful boil on his neck. That was another thing that Admiral Byrd discovered down in the terrible cold and darkness of the polar nights, that his men fussed more about the pains in the neck than about the big things. They bore, without complaining, the dangers, the hardships, the cold that was often 80 degrees below zero. But, says Admiral Byrd, I know of bunkmates who quit speaking because each suspected the other of inching his gear into the other's allotted space. And I knew of one who could not eat unless he could find a place in the mess hall out of sight of the Fletcherist who solemnly chewed his food 28 times before swallowing. In a polar camp, says Admiral Byrd, little things like that have the power to even drive disciplined men to the edge of insanity. And you might have added, Admiral Byrd, that little things in marriage drive people to the edge of insanity and cause half the heartaches in the world. At least, that is what authorities say. For example, Judge Joseph Sabbath of Chicago was acting as arbiter in more than 40,000 unhappy marriages. He declared trivialities are at the bottom of most marital unhappiness. And Frank S. Hogan, former district attorney of New York County, says, fully half the cases in our criminal courts originate in little things. Barroom bravado, domestic wranglings, an insulting remark, a disparaging word, a rude action. Those are the little things that lead to assault and murder. Very few of us are cruelly and greatly wronged. It is the small blows to our self-esteem, the indignities and little jolts to our vanity, which cause half the heartaches in the world. When Eleanor Roosevelt was first married, she was worried for days because her new cook had served a poor meal. But if that happened now, Mrs. Roosevelt said, I would shrug my shoulders and forget it. Good. That is acting like an adult emotionally. Even Catherine the Great, an absolute autocrat, was used to laughing the thing off when the cook spoiled a meal. Mrs. Carnegie, and I had dinner at a friend's house in Chicago. While carving the meat, he did something wrong. I didn't notice it, and I wouldn't have cared even if I had noticed. But his wife saw it and jumped down his throat right in front of us. John, she cried, watch what you're doing. How can you ever learn to serve properly? Then she said to us, he's always making mistakes. He just doesn't try. Maybe he didn't try to carve, but certainly I did give him credit for trying to live with her for 20 years. Frankly, I would have rather had eaten a couple of hot dogs with mustard in an atmosphere of peace than have dined on Peking duck and shark fins while listening to her scolding. Shortly after that experience, Mrs. Carnegie and I had some friends at our home for dinner. Just before they arrived, Mrs. Carnegie found that 3 of the napkins didn't match the tablecloth. I rushed to the cook, she told me later, and I found that the other 3 napkins had gone to the laundry. The guests were at the door. There were no time to change. I felt like bursting into tears. All I could think was, why did the stupid mistake have to spoil my whole evening? Then I thought, well, why let it? I went to dinner, determined to have a good time, and I did. I would much rather our friends think I'm a sloppy housekeeper, she told me, than have a nervous, bad-tempered one. And anyhow, as far as I could make out, no one noticed the napkins. A well-known legal maxim says, "De minimis non curat lex." Sorry, I don't speak Latin. The law does not concern itself with trifles, and neither should the worrier, if he wants peace of mind. Much of the time, all we need to overcome the annoyances of trifles is to effect a shifting of emphasis, set up a new and pleasurable point of view in the mind. My friend Homer Croy, who wrote They Had to See Paris and a dozen other books, gives a wonderful example of how this can be done. He used to be driven half crazy while working on a book by the rattling of the radiators in his New York apartment. The steam would bang and sizzle, and he would sizzle with irritation as he sat at his desk. Then, says Homer Croy, I went with some friends on a camping expedition. While listening to the limbs creak and crackling in the roaring fire, I thought how much they sounded like the crackling of the radiators. And why should I like one and hate the other? When I went home, I said to myself, the crackling of the limbs in the fire was a pleasant sound, and the sound of the radiators is about the same. I'll go to sleep and not worry about the noise. And I did. For a few days I was conscious of the radiators, but soon I forgot all about them. And so it is with many petty worries. We dislike them and get into a stew, all because we exaggerate their importance. Disraeli said, quote, life is too short to be little. Those words, said Andre Maroy in This Week magazine, quote, have helped me through many a painful experience. Often we allow ourselves to be upset by small things we should despise and forget. Here we are on this earth with only a few more decades to live, and we lose many irreplaceable hours brooding over grievances that in a year's time will be forgotten by us and by everybody. Now let us devote our life to worry. Now let us devote to worry. Oh my goodness. Now let us devote our life to worthwhile actions and feelings, to great thoughts, real affections and enduring undertakings, for life is too short to be little. Even so illustrious a figure as Rudyard Kipling forgot at times that life is too short to be little. The result, he and his brother-in-law fought the most famous court battle in the history of Vermont, a battle so celebrated that a book had been written about it, Rudyard Kipling's Vermont Feud. The story goes like this. Kipling married a Vermont girl, Caroline Ballister, built a lovely home in Brattleboro, Vermont, settled down, and expected to spend the rest of their life there. His brother-in-law, Beatty Ballister, became Kipling's best friend, and the two of them worked and played together. Then Kipling bought some land from Ballister with the understanding that Ballister would be allowed to cut hay off it each season. One day, Ballister found Kipling laying out a flower garden on his hayfield. His blood boiled. He hit the ceiling. Kipling fired it back. The air over the green mountains of Vermont turned blue. A few days later, when Kipling was out riding his bicycle, his brother-in-law drove a wagon and a team of horses across the road and suddenly forced Kipling to take a spill. And Kipling, the man who wrote, quote, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, he lost his own head and swore out a warrant for Ballister's arrest. Did I read that quote right in the beginning? Sorry. The man who wrote, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. He lost his own head and swore out a warrant for Ballister's arrest. A sensational trial followed. Reporters from big cities poured into the town. The news flashed around the world. Nothing was settled. This quarrel caused Kipling and his wife to abandon their American home for the rest of their lives. All that worry and bitterness over a mere trifle, a load of hay. Pericles said 24 centuries ago, "Come, gentlemen, we sit too long on trifles." We do, indeed. Here is one of the most interesting stories that Dr. Hay Emerson Fosdick ever told. A story about the battles won and lost by a giant of the forest. On the slope of Long Peak in Colorado lies a ruin of a gigantic tree. Naturalists tell us that it stood for some 400 years. It was a seedling when Columbus landed at St. Salvador, and half grown when the Pilgrims settled at Plymouth. During the course of its long life, it was struck by lightning 14 times, and the innumerable avalanches and storms of 4 centuries thundered past it. It survived them all, and in the end, however, an army of beetles attacked the tree and leveled it to the ground. The insects ate their way through the bark and gradually destroyed the inner strength of the tree by their tiny but incessant attacks. A forest giant, which age had not withered, nor lightning blasted, nor storm subdued, fell at last before beetles, so small that a man could crush them between his forefinger and his thumb. Aren't we all like that battling giant of the forest? Don't we manage somehow to survive the rare storms and avalanches and lightning blasts of life, only to let our hearts be eaten by little beetles of worry? Little beetles that could be crushed between a finger and a thumb. I traveled through Teton National Park in Wyoming with Charles Seyfried, highway superintendent for the state of Wyoming, so bad with names, and some of his friends. We were going to visit the John D. Rockefeller estate in the park, but the car in which I was riding took the wrong turn, got lost, and drove up the entrance of the estate an hour after the other cars had got there. Mr. Seyfried had the key that unlocked the private gate, so he waited at the hot mosquito-infested woods for an hour until we arrived. The mosquitoes were enough to drive a saint insane, but they couldn't triumph over Charles Seyfried. While waiting for us, he had limbed off an aspen tree and made a whistle of it. Then when we arrived, was he cussing at the mosquitoes? No, he was playing his whistle. I have kept that whistle as a memento of a man who knew how to put the trifles in their place, to break the worry habit before it breaks you. Here is number 2. Rule number 2. Let's not allow ourselves to be upset by small things we should despise and forget. Remember, life is too short to be little. There is a part that I want to mention that, was it Sirhan? He was writing something about something similar. He's like, was it Sirhan? I forget who. Basically, you have your journal, and, it'd be nice if you date each page ahead of time, and then go a month in advance. So if for example, if it's December 5th, you go to January 5th. You go to January 5th and write down what happened and how you feel about it. And then when you go through your journal day by day and then you reach January 5th, you read what you wrote a month ago and you say, how do I feel about it now? And chances are you won't even remember it. But it lets you vent a little at the time, but also you get into the habit of saying, when I write something down in the future that I think is going to be essentially non-issue in a month's time, you start training your brain and say, forget it. In a month, it's not going to matter. In a month, it's not going to matter. And you do that enough, and soon enough, you have that little worry, I didn't do this. I couldn't close that deal, whatever. In a month, you'll read it and won't care, and then you'll be in the habit of not having to have that worry in the first place. Anyway, that was chapter 7. That's just a little bit of advice. If you take it or leave it, try it out. If you don't mind it, you just have to do it a couple times. It doesn't take that much time. Just see if it works for you. It's better than having to worry about it, right? So, chapter 8's next. Chapter 8. A law that will outlaw.
many of your worries. As a child, I grew up on a Missouri farm, and one day, while helping my mother pick cherries, I began to cry. My mother said, "Dale, what in the world are you crying about?" I blubbered, "I'm afraid I'm going to be buried alive." I was full of worries in those days. When thunderstorms came, I worried for fear I would be killed by lightning. When hard times came, I worried for fear we wouldn't have enough to eat. I worried for fear I would go to hell when I died. I was terrified for fear of an older boy, Sam White, would cut off my big ears, as he threatened to do. I worried for fear girls would laugh at me if I tipped my hat at them. I worried for fear no girl would ever be willing to marry me. I worried about what I would say to my wife immediately after we were married. I imagined that we would be married in some country church, and then get in a surrey with fringe on the top and ride back to the farm. But how would I be able to keep the conversation going on that ride back to the farm? How? I pondered over that earth-shaking problem for many an hour as I walked behind the plow. As the years went by, I gradually discovered that 99% of the things I was worried about never happened. For example, as I already said, I was once terrified of lightning, but now know the chances of me being killed by lightning in any 1 year are, according to the National Safety Council, only 1 in 350,000. My fear of being buried alive was even more absurd. I don't imagine that, even back in the days before embalming was the rule, that 1 person in 10 million was buried alive. Yet I once cried for fear of it. 1 person out of every 8 dies of cancer. If I had wanted something to worry about, I should have worried about cancer instead of being killed by lightning or buried alive. To be sure, I have been talking about the worries of youth and adolescence, but many of our adult worries are almost as absurd. You and I could probably eliminate 9/10 of our worries right now if we would cease our fretting long enough to discover whether, by the law of averages, there was any real justification to our worries. The most famous insurance company on earth, Lloyd's of London, has made countless millions of dollars out of the tendency of everybody to worry about things that rarely happen. Lloyd's of London bets people that disasters that they're worrying about will never occur. However, they don't call it betting, they call it insurance. But it is really betting based on the law of averages. This great insurance firm has been going strong for over 200 years, and unless human nature changes, it will still be going strong 50 centuries from now by insuring shoes, ships, and sealing wax against disasters that, by the law of averages, don't happen nearly so often as people imagine. If we examine the law of averages, we will often be astounded at the facts we uncover. For example, if we knew that during the next 5 years I would have to fight in a battle as bloody as the Battle of Gettysburg, I would be terrified. I would take out all the life insurance I could get. I would draw up my will and set all of my earthly affairs in order. I would say, I'll probably never live through that battle, so I better make the most of the few years I have left. Yet the facts are that, according to the law of averages, it's just as dangerous and just as fatal to try to live from about 50 to the age 55 in peacetime as it is to fight in the Battle of Gettysburg. What I'm trying to say is this: in the times of peace, just as many people die per 1,000 between the ages of 50 and 55 as were killed per 1,000 among the 163,000 soldiers who fought at Gettysburg. I wrote several chapters of this book at James Simpson's Num Ti Ga Lodge, I don't know what that is, on the shore of Bow Lake in the Canadian Rockies. While stopping there one summer, I met Mr. and Mrs. Herbert H. Salinger of San Francisco. Mrs. Salinger, a poised, serene woman, gave me the impression that she had never worried. One evening in front of the roaring fireplace, I asked if she had ever been troubled by worry. Troubled by it, she said. My life was almost ruined by it before I learned to conquer worry. I lived through 11 years of self-made hell. I was irritable and hot-tempered. I lived under terrific tension. I would take the bus every week from my home in San Mateo to shop in San Francisco. But even while shopping, I worried myself to a dither. Maybe I had left the electric iron connected to the ironing board. Maybe the house had caught fire. Maybe the maid had run off and left the children. Maybe they had gone out on their bicycles and been killed by a car. In the midst of my shopping, I would often worry myself into a cold perspiration and rush out and take the bus home to see if everything was all right. No wonder my first marriage ended in disaster. My second husband is a lawyer, a quiet, analytical man who never worries about anything. When I became tense and anxious, he would say to me, "Relax, let's think this out. What are you really worried about? Let's examine the law of averages and see whether or not it is likely to happen." For example, I remember the time we were driving from Albuquerque, New Mexico to the Carlsbad Caverns, driving on a dirt road, when we were caught in a terrible rainstorm. The car was slithering and sliding. We couldn't control it. I was positive we would slide off one of the ditches that flanked the road. But as my husband kept repeating to me, "I'm driving very slowly. Nothing serious is likely to happen. Even if the car does slide into the ditch, by the law of averages, we won't be hurt." His calmness and confidence quieted me. One summer we were on a camping trip in the Toquin Valley of the Canadian Rockies. One evening we were camping 7,000 feet above sea level when a storm threatened to tear our tents to shreds. The tents were tied with guy ropes to a wooden platform. The outer tent shook and trembled and screamed and shrieked in the wind. I expected every minute to see our tent torn loose and hurled through the sky. I was terrified. But my husband kept saying, "Look, dear, we are traveling with the Brewsters' guides. Brewsters know what they're doing. They have been pitching tents in these mountains for 60 years. This tent has been here for many seasons. It hasn't blown down yet, and by the law of averages, it won't blow away tonight. And even if it does, we can take shelter in another tent. So relax." I did, and I slept soundly at the balance of the night. A few years ago, an infantile paralysis epidemic swept over our part of California. In the old days, I would have been hysterical, but my husband persuaded me to act calmly. We took all the precautions we could. We kept our children away from crowds, away from school, the movies, and by consulting the Board of Health, we found out that even during the worst infantile paralysis epidemic in California ever had known up to that time, only 1,835 children had been stricken in the entire state of California. And the usual number was around 200 to 300. Tragic as those figures are, we nevertheless felt that, according to the law of averages, the chances of any one child being stricken were remote. By the law of averages, it won't happen. That phrase has destroyed 90% of my worries, and it has made the past 20 years of my life beautiful and peaceful beyond the highest expectations. It has been said that nearly all of our worries and unhappiness come from our imagination and not from reality. As I look back across the decades, I could see that this is where most of my worries come from also. Jim Grant told me that this has been his experience too. He owned the James A. Grant Distributing Company of New York City. He ordered from 10 to 15 carloads of Florida oranges and grapefruit at the time. He told me that he used to torture himself with such thoughts as, what if there's a train wreck? What if my fruit is strewn all over the countryside? What if a bridge collapses and my cars are going across it? Of course, the fruit was uninsured, but he feared that if he didn't deliver his fruit on time, he might risk the loss of his market. He worried so much that he feared he had stomach ulcers and went to the doctor. The doctor told him there was nothing wrong with him except jumpy nerves. I saw the light then, he said, and began to ask myself questions. I said to myself, look here, Jim Grant, how many fruit cars have you handled over the years? The answer was about 25,000. Then I asked myself, how many of those cars were ever wrecked? The answer was, maybe 5. Then I said to myself, only 5 out of 25,000. You know what that means, a ratio of 5,000 to 1. In other words, by the law of averages, based on experience, the chances are 5,000 to 1 against one of your car ever being wrecked. So what are you worried about? Then I said to myself, well, a bridge might collapse. Then I asked myself, how many cars have you actually lost from a bridge collapsing? The answer was none. And then I said to myself, aren't you a fool for being worried about yourself into stomach ulcers over a bridge which has never yet collapsed, and over a railroad wreck when the chances are 5,000 to 1 against it? When I looked at it that way, Jim Grant told me, I felt pretty silly. I decided then and there that to let the law of averages do the worrying for me, and I have not been troubled with my stomach ulcer since. When Al Smith was governor of New York, I heard him answer the attacks of his political enemies by saying over and over, let's examine the record. Let's examine the record. Then he proceeds to give the facts. The next time you and I are worrying about something that may happen, let's take a tip from old, wise Al Smith. Let's examine the record and see what the basis there is, if any, for our gnawing anxieties. That is precisely what Frederick J. Malstead did when he feared he was lying in his grave. Here's a story he told to one of our classes in New York. Early in June 1944, I was lying in a slit trench near Omaha Beach. I was with the 999th Signal Service Company, and we had just dug in Normandy. As I looked around at that slit trench, just a rectangular hole in the ground, I said to myself, this looks just like a grave. When I laid down and tried to sleep in it, it felt like a grave. I couldn't help saying to myself, maybe this is my grave. When the German bombers started coming over at 11 p.m., the bombs started falling. I was scared stiff. For the first 2 or 3 nights, I couldn't sleep at all. By the 4th or 5th night, I was almost a nervous wreck. I knew that if I didn't do something, I would go stark crazy. So I reminded myself that 5 nights had passed and I was still alive, and so was every man in our outfit. Only 2 had been injured, and they had been hurt, not by German bombs, but by falling flak from our own anti-aircraft guns. I decided to stop worrying by doing something constructive, so I built a thick wooden roof over my slit trench to protect myself from flak. I thought of the vast area over which my unit was spread. I told myself the only way I could be killed in that deep, narrow slit trench was by a direct hit. I figured out that the chance of a direct hit on me was not 1 in 10,000. After a couple nights of looking at it in this way, I calmed down and slept even through the bomb raids. The United States Navy used the statistics of law of averages to buck up the morale of their men. One ex-soldier told me that when he and his shipmates were assigned to high-octane tankers, they were worried stiff. They all believed that if a tanker loaded with high-octane gasoline was hit by a torpedo, it exploded and everyone would explode everyone to kingdom come. But the U.S. Navy knew otherwise. So the Navy issued exact figures showing that out of 100 tankers hit by torpedoes, 60 stayed afloat, and the 40 that did sink, only 5 sank in less than 10 minutes. That meant time to get off the ship. It also meant casualties were exceedingly small. Did this help morale? Quote, this knowledge of the law of averages wiped out my jitters, said Clyde W. Moss of St. Paul, Minnesota, the man who told the story. The whole crew felt better. We knew we had a chance, and that, by the law of averages, we probably wouldn't be killed. To break the worry habit before it breaks you, here's rule number 3. Let's examine the record. Let's ask ourselves, what are the chances, according to the law of averages, that this event that I'm worrying about will ever occur?